Okay, so I will in fact be doing the heavy cavalry list now, and that's because I can team it with an interesting observation that I made while doing some additional testing earlier on today, and that is the fact that the following tends to happen in a cav versus cav fight. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure what's going on with that. Maybe something's gone a little wrong in the last patch, but I don't know. Something's off with the cavalry. But fortunately, I had managed to do all of the important tests before the most recent patch came out, so I will be able to give an informed list on what I think the top 10 heavy cavalry is, and so we'll start at number 10. So at number 10 we have the Temple Inquisitors. Now I was debating whether or not to put these guys on the list at all, because there are some sort of pure shock cavalry units which arguably do the job of slaying infantry a little bit better, but I think overall what the Temple Inquisitors offer you is something a little different, that you can frighten the enemy, and also in cavalry to cavalry fights, under normal circumstances, they will do very well for themselves because of their high stats, particularly their high base attack, which helps them. So they're kind of like a hybrid of melee cav and shock cav, but they don't sacrifice the charge all that much, to be honest. So, in terms of stats, we're looking at 18 attack, 30 defense, and 15 charge. And they frighten nearby enemies, and they have excellent armor and stamina. And they have 2 hit points. Of course, most units that are on these lists now will come with hit points unless there's something else about them. Like with the spears, like I am having to take other things into account as well. But with the cavalry, most of the time, if you have hit points, you're going to be putting yourself in a much better place because you're going to be more resilient to arrows. And in a cav to cav fight, you're going to be able to just outlast the enemy. But yeah, that is the Temple Inquisitors, or the Black Numenorians, to give them their old name. Just about scraping onto this list, so we shall now move on to number 9. So at number 9 we have a Sylvan Elven melee cavalry unit, and it is the Eldar Pathfinders. Now obviously they look very, very impressive with these antlers and such, very recognisable from the Hobbit movies, but in terms of stats, we're looking at 17 attack, 23 defense, and 18 charge, and at first glance that isn't terribly impressive, especially compared to some other cavalry units that didn't even make the list. But they are good in woods and versus armor, they frighten the enemy, they can form wedge, and they have excellent armor and stamina, and of course they have 2 hit points. And I have noticed as well that against enemy cavalry, particularly sort of mid-tier enemy cavalry, these guys will chew through them, like with relative ease, to be honest with you. Also, you know, I had to include them on the list simply because of how they look. Like, there was maybe a case for having another Harad unit on here that isn't on here, but ultimately I think that the Eldar Pathfinders managed to... Their cavalry to cavalry combat is so impressive that I had to include them on the list, I think, which is a very important part of your cavalry, because often your cavalry will be tangled up in engagements like that before they can get at the enemy infantry, so to be able to get through that with as little damage done to you as possible is very important. And it's also good to see the Sylvan Elves finally make one of these lists, because they have been rather cut out of the heavy infantry ones I've done. Nonetheless, we shall now move on to number 8. And at number 8 we have the very impressive looking Brotherhood of the Lance. Their stats are 16 attack, 30 defense, and 18 charge. Now that's a pretty decent defense and a very good charge score. 18 is pretty much as high as you can get. They're good versus cavalry, and in deserts they frighten the enemy and have excellent armor and stamina, and of course have 2 hit points. Ultimately, the only reason why they're not higher, because their stats are better than some of the units that are ahead of them, are the fact that they do have a significantly lower amount of men in the unit. 43 it's where it starts to get a little noticeable next to their peers, and you know, the more cav you have in the unit, the easier it is to get a nice charge off. So ultimately I have to say that the Brotherhood of the Lance do miss out on a higher spot because of that, but nonetheless they do give Rune a very deadly centre to their cavalry, particularly if you flank them with their Variad cataphracts. Rune are now a very viable cavalry-focused faction. So now we shall move on to number 7. At number 7, another faction makes their debut on the Reforged top 10 list, and that is Rohan and their Royal Guard. So their stats are 14 attack, 28 defense, and 16 charge. That's relatively low compared to some other units on the list, but they still managed to get here because of their high charge, and of course they have a decent amount of men in the unit, so they do manage to just about outperform the Brotherhood of the Lance in combat. And they are also good versus armor. They can form wedge, they have good stamina, and they have excellent armor, and of course 2 hit points. The Royal Guard are a big part of what make Rohan an attractive faction to play because, well, you know, Rohan are obviously all about their cavalry. They depend on it very much. They need to do as much damage as possible because their infantry is not quite as tanky as pretty much any other faction now, to be honest with you, because every other faction has got some new units apart from Rohan. But the Royal Guard are still very, very good, of course. They were the 3rd best cavalry unit in vanilla. They have been outmuscled by some of the new stuff down to 7th, but they are still able to hold their own with pretty much anything. And of course, Rohan couldn't have it any other way. So now we'll move on to number 6. So at number 6 we have another returning unit, and it was the unit that finished just above the Royal Guard in the vanilla list, and that is of course the Swan Knights. Their stats are now 13 attack, 33 defense, and 17 charge. They are good versus armor and have excellent armor, so not a lot of abilities, but they also have 2 hit points. Their base stats are really what gets them this high on the list. That defense is very nice to have. It means they're difficult to kill off, and that high charge as well. Very, very nice to have. Simply because, you know, obviously the Swan Knights very, very useful for Gondor, because Gondor, their infantry is typically rather static with the amount of spears that they have, but their cavalry is where they rely on to get their mobility and their blunt damage done, and the Swan Knights are still a very big part of that, of course. Their slight weakness perhaps is the fact that their base attack score is not as high as quite a lot of other units on this list, which means in cavalry to cavalry fights, as they get drawn out, the Swan Knights will start to lose. But other than that, the Swan Knights are still the tour de force that they always were. Slightly outperformed now by certain other units, but we'll get onto that. And they close off the bottom half of this list, and now we'll move on to number 5. So the previous top 3 are now 5 to 7, as the previous winners of the list are now at number 5, the Knights of the Numinous of Arnor, and their stats are 14 attack, 31 defense, and 16 charge. They are good versus armor, they have good stamina, excellent armor themselves, and they can form wedge, and they of course have 2 hit points. Now the Knights of the Numinous always were, in vanilla, easily the best cavalry unit because of how tanky they were. They are now actually a lot closer to the Swan Knights and the Royal Guard in terms of how good they actually are, but they are still the best of the 3 in my opinion because of their very high attack score and prolonged melee. It makes the Knights of the Numinous very dominant in cavalry to cavalry fights, and they still have that nasty charge that they can get off. And of course they still have their wonderful looks, that black and silver, very, very nice indeed. But the Knights of the Numinous are now beaten by 4 other units that are above them. And we shall now, well, we'll start off at number 4. And at number 4, the Witch Realm units of Gundabad impressed me once again because the Witch Realm Inquisitors are here, and their stats are 18 attack, 34 defense, and 16 charge. They inspire nearby allies, they have excellent armor and stamina, but perhaps most importantly they have 3 hit points. The only unit on this list to have 3 hit points, actually. But still, you know, the reason they got this high was because of their 3 hit points and their excellent stats, but the reason they couldn't get any higher is because they don't have many men in the unit. Obviously, they have even less than the Brotherhood of the Lance, but their base stats were good enough to get them on this list, that high charge. They look like melee cavalry because of the sword and shield arrangement that they have, but they have a very high charge as well, which means they do actually function as shock cavalry, even if they don't look like it. And of course, the Witch Realm units look terrific, of course, that helm, the black. I am still surprised that the Orcs of Gundabad Witch Realm units are better than the Black Numenorian units of Mordor. Across the board as well, it's been on every list so far with all the relevant things. The only thing that the Black Numenorian units will be able to beat them in is archery, but even so, the Witch Realm Inquisitors all the way up at number 4, managing to beat the Knights of the Numinous of Arnor, and that's impressive. Although, of course, this could change in future patches, like the cavalry has changed from patch 0.6 to 0.7, and in 0.7 they behave a little weirdly, of course, but I would expect the Witcher Realm Inquisitors honestly to be one of the units that is changed. I would expect their charge to be blunted so that they perform more as melee cavalry based on their weaponry alone. So I would expect if any units on this list were to be changed drastically, this would be the one that I would expect it to happen to most of all. But for now, at least, they are way up here at number 4. But now we'll move on to number 3. I'm sure you've been wondering where the High Elves have been, and here they are. Starting at number 3, we have the Eldar Nobles. So, in terms of stats, we're looking at 13 attack, 33 defense, and 18 charge. They're good versus armor, excellent armor and good stamina, and 2 hit points. And it's really the high defense and high charge which nets them this point on the list. And also, it's nice to see the Eldar Nobles actually useful now. In vanilla, they never really were. The Lancers were always much better because they would just have more in the unit. But now, the Eldar Nobles with their hit points are finally useful, and that's good because their armor looks superb, as do most of the High Elven units, it must be said. And now, with their Lancers, will be very useful indeed. You'll often find the General in this unit, of course, because it is intended to be a General bodyguard unit, so they will often have 44. That isn't a huge amount, but their very high stats ultimately do carry them this high on the list. The Brotherhood of the Lance, of course, you could say they have comparable stats, but their defense is low enough that it does actually affect them in cavalry-to-cavalry fights, whereas the Eldar Nobles, I should say, fare much better in a cavalry-to-cavalry fight. There may be things going on behind the scenes that the base stats just don't show us, but from what I saw in the test, the Eldar Nobles were able to outmuscle units that the Brotherhood of the Lance simply could not. However, there were 2 units which were better than them, and we'll now go to number 2. And at number 2, we have almost certainly my favourite new unit that Reforged has added so far in the Knights of the Silver Swan, because undoubtedly, in my mind, they are now the best looking unit in the game. I mean, look at them. That is majestic. And the Knights of the Silver Swan have the following stats. They have 13 attack, 42 defense, and 16 charge. They inspire nearby units, they have excellent armor, they're good versus cavalry and armor, they can form wedge, and they have 2 hit points. They are monsters on horseback, they really are. Superb unit, really. Gondor, teaming these guys with the regular Swan Knights gives Gondor a terrifying cavalry force, to be honest with you. Very expensive, but terrifying. And the Knights of the Silver Swan, certainly, in terms of looks, my favourite unit. Like, I can't get over their helms and how good their shields look and their capes and everything. It's like the most elite of the Swan Knights in one unit. But yes, that is the Swan Knights. But once again, Gondor's finest have been beaten to the number 1 spot by a unit. But which unit is that? Well, let's go take a look. And so, at number 1, we have the Imladris Cavalry. And in terms of stats, you may wonder why, because they have 15 attack, 30 defense, and 18 charge, which is beaten by certain other units on the list. They're basically a slightly better version of the Nobles, just looking at the stats. They inspire their nearby units, they have excellent armor and stamina, and they are good versus armor, and of course 2 HP. And I can only imagine there's certain things going on behind the scenes that I'm not aware of, because the Knights of the Silver Swan could beat the Eldar Nobles handily, and yet the Imladris Cavalry is able to beat them. And of course, against infantry, all of these units are going to be very devastating because of their extremely high charge scores, especially the Imladris Cavalry at 18. One less unit than the Eldar Nobles, but it doesn't really matter. They actually look kind of, how do I say it, simplistic compared to a lot of units. Although the standard High Elven helms and units are all there, they still look terrific, of course. But yes, the Imladris Cavalry, at least at this point in the game's life cycle, I'm sure the patches will rejig all these lists around a certain amount, which is, going to happen, so I'm going to have to sort of keep an eye out for that. But at least for now, in my opinion, the Imladris Cavalry are top of the tree when it comes to the heavy cavalry on 3rd Age Reforged. And that is it for the heavy cavalry list. The top 10. So, as for the next list I'll do, I don't know, I think I will do the Spears next, but as I said, I did this because I did want to highlight the fact that cavalry seems to be behaving rather strangely ever since the 0.7 patch, at least for me. But yes, that was the cavalry, and hopefully next will be the Spears, and I will try and get the Gondor faction overview done relatively soon. It is worth saying as well that I was doing a custom scenario last night in Tol Falas, I think the map was called. And it was going really well until it crashed, which is a real shame because I really wanted to post a custom scenario. I really want to start doing them and uploading them. But alas, it was not to be. I will try again, of course, with a custom scenario of some description, but hopefully that will be coming very soon as well. But for the time being, that was the cavalry. We'll be doing the spears at some point in the near future. Gondor will be happening at some point in the near future, and more battles, of course. And I hope to see you for whatever is next.